After I finished Holly at Hogwarts and the potions contest, my daughter Amanda said, "Write more!" So here it is: Holly at Hogwarts, Return to Neverland. Chapter 1. The unmistakable coughing sounds of someone vomiting echoed throughout the bathroom. "Holly?" called Laurel Wycliffe, peering into the tiled room. "Holly, baby, are you all right?" Then came the sound of the toilet flushing. Laurel followed the sound to an open stall and found Holly kneeling over the toilet. Her long blonde hair hid her face. Holly brushed the strands away from one side and wiped her mouth with a tissue. "Holly?" Laurel repeated softly, kneeling down next to her. "Are you okay?" Holly tossed the tissue into the toilet, turned her head, and looked at Laurel. Her cheeks were shiny and wet, streaked with tears. "I tried, Mum. Really I did," Holly said. She wiped her face with her sleeve. "But when that waitress came out with that steak for the person behind us and I caught the smell as she passed by," she continued, "I had this sudden flash of the crash and those charred bodies. My stomach got all queasy and I just couldn't bear it." Holly leaned into Laurel, and Laurel wrapped her arms around Holly in a tight hug. "I know, dear," said Laurel soothingly. "It's okay, baby. We understand." Holly had become a vegetarian recently and had a difficult time standing the smell of freshly cooked meat. Normally, the family would have taken that into consideration when selecting an eating establishment, but it had been late, and it was the only place still open in the village. Everyone was tired and hungry, and no one wanted to continue driving to look for someplace else. Holly looked up at Laurel, her green eyes brimming with tears. "Please," she begged. "Can't I just wait in the car until you're done? Order me something safe, like a salad, and have them wrap it, and I'll eat later. I don't mind waiting, really." "Of course," said Laurel reassuringly, releasing Holly. "We can do that. You wait here until I come back with the car keys." Holly sat down on the cold tile floor next to the toilet. She leaned her back against the stall wall and hugged her knees tightly, burying her face in her lap. Laurel stood and walked out of the stall. A few months ago, Holly had helped on a rescue mission at an airplane crash site. The events of that day still haunted her. Holly had become a vegetarian in an effort to cope with the experience. The scent and sometimes just the sight of any cooked meat reminded Holly of the dead, burned bodies she had seen and could make her violently ill. "How is she?" asked her husband Dylan with concern when Laurel reached their table. He and their son Vernon were still seated and had been studying their menus in her absence. The family had barely sat down at the table when Holly had suddenly bolted for the restroom. "She's fine," replied Laurel, reaching for her purse, "but she's going to wait outside in the car until we're finished." Dylan nodded. Laurel fished out her keys and then glanced quickly at the menu. "I'm going to unlock the car for her," she announced. "If the waiter comes back before that, just order the steak and kidney pie for me. Might as well have some proper meat while Holly wasn't around. And a salad for takeout." "Will do," replied Dylan. Laurel returned to the bathroom. She found Holly by the sink. Holly's face and hands were still wet, having been freshly cleaned, and her hair was neatly pulled back. The two walked outside to their car. Holly's gray cat Sasha greeted her happily. The cat immediately curled up in Holly's lap while purring loudly once Holly got seated. Holly stroked the cat absently while staring vacantly out the window. Laurel sighed as she walked back into the cafe. She heartily wished the parenting books she had read covered situations like this. She didn't like leaving Holly alone, but what else could she do? It wasn't like Holly could sit with them in the cafe, and the loo was no place to wait. Laurel sat down next to Dylan and across from Vernon. They had already placed their order. When it arrived, Laurel noted they had both chosen a steak, something they would not have done around Holly. Laurel ate quickly, almost guiltily, knowing Holly was waiting in the car. As soon as she had finished, Laurel took the packaged salad and returned to the car, leaving Dylan to take care of the bill. Holly took the salad, silently nodding her thanks, and absently picked at the food, still clearly upset by what had happened. Soon after, Dylan and Vernon returned to the car. They silently got in. Dylan started the engine, and they all continued on their way. The family had been on the road for 3 days, traveling around Great Britain looking at schools. Dylan didn't like that Holly had become a vegetarian, but had promised to not argue about it. He also told his parents that he could not abide by any school that permitted its students to become vegetarian, and had decided to transfer Holly to someplace else. Dylan's parents, Violet and Vincent Wycliffe, who regularly enjoyed roast beef, pork chops, and fried chicken, readily agreed, even offering to help cover the expenses of the transfer. Dylan refused their offer of help, preferring to do that part on his own. Of course, Holly becoming a vegetarian was just the excuse Dylan gave to his parents. Dylan actually wanted Holly out of that school, long before she'd become a vegetarian. The school in question was called Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. 2 years ago, Holly had become deathly ill. In desperation, Dylan had sought help from a cousin Laurel had never known existed. The cousin, named Harry Potter, found a doctor who cured Holly. Then Harry told Laurel and Dylan that Holly was something called an empath. Empaths could feel emotions, and Cousin Harry said the best place to train someone with that kind of skill was at Hogwarts. Harry Potter had apparently attended Hogwarts. He claimed to be a wizard of some sort, though he didn't look like one. In fact, he looked rather ordinary in that plain gray suit he always wore. Laurel had never taken much stock in the stories of the paranormal. She'd read too many accounts of the tricks of the trade to believe in that stuff. She thought Dylan had felt the same. Laurel found it astounding to discover that Dylan, deep down, believed in magic. Despite the stories she'd heard from Holly and the few bits of magic she'd seen for herself, Laurel still felt there was some sort of scientific explanation for what Harry and Holly claimed to practice. She just didn't know what it was. Holly had attended Hogwarts for the last 2 years, and Laurel had to admit Holly never looked better. But Dylan had deep misgivings about the school and its people. He would not rest easy until Holly was attending somewhere else. Dylan had informed Harry of his decision when the family met at the station to pick up Holly at the beginning of summer vacation. The encounter had actually gone rather smoothly. That part was Laurel's contribution. She realized she could never change Dylan's mind about removing Holly from Hogwarts, but she could change the method. Last year, Dylan had been adamant Holly never returned to Hogwarts and exceedingly rude about the situation. Laurel was equally adamant that such a scene would not be repeated. "I know you don't like him," she told Dylan, "but this is not his fault. This is not that school's fault." Dylan hated even the name Hogwarts. "It's nobody's fault. You just don't want her there. I don't know what kind of a childhood you two had together," Laurel continued, "and I don't care. Get over it. That man has watched out for Holly for 2 years and has never done anything but treat us, even you, with the utmost courtesy and respect. I expect you to do the same. If he can do it, then so can you. You're both adults now, and I expect you to act accordingly." "Furthermore," Laurel added threateningly, "no matter how much you hate each other, you two are still family, and you will not burn any bridges over this." That's what Dylan had tried to do last year. It failed dismally because Holly wanted to return to Hogwarts so bad she practically forced Dylan to agree. As Dylan would have nothing to do with the place, Harry Potter was the one who had to make all the arrangements for her to attend Hogwarts. And just in case Dylan didn't take her seriously, Laurel had added, "And if you are anything but courteous to your cousin while at the station, the next time I see your parents, I will mention to them how we had lunch with somebody named Harry Potter during Christmas vacation." Dylan positively paled at her words. "You wouldn't," he protested weakly. Dylan's parents didn't know he had contacted Harry Potter or that Holly had been attending Hogwarts. Dylan spent the last 2 years trying to keep that information from them. He even named Harry as Holly's legal guardian while at that school to ensure his parents would find no stray letters from Hogwarts. They apparently hated Harry Potter and Hogwarts even more than Dylan did. "I would," countered Laurel firmly. "Besides," she insisted, "it's the truth." Laurel and Dylan had shared a meal with Harry after a huge snowstorm, but it had been anything but a social visit. Holly had gotten herself into a bit of trouble, and they were trying to straighten it out. No doubt the last threat did the trick. Dylan was clearly more afraid of what his parents would do should they find out about Harry than of talking civilly to his cousin. For weeks afterwards, Laurel woke in the middle of the night to the sound of Dylan pacing in the living room, practicing what he would say. Harry, said Dylan rather uncomfortably after polite greetings had been exchanged at the station, I've decided Holly won't be returning next year. Cousin Harry's tall, slender frame seemed to relax a fraction before he spoke. Yeah, he finally said with a heavy sigh. I kind of figured that. What school do you want the transcripts to say? Began Dylan uncertainly. He hadn't gotten past the notification part in his practicing, anticipating more of an argument from Harry. Puddinghampton, I guess, he finally replied. That was the school Holly had attended before Hogwarts. Harry nodded. I'll get on that right away. He turned to Holly. Remember what we talked about? He told Holly sternly. I expect you to mind your parents about this. Holly looked steadily at Harry, her green eyes already glistening with tears. Yes, sir, she replied in a low voice, with just a touch of tremor in her lips. Laurel got the impression the two had already had a long discussion about this. She could tell Holly would make no attempt to return to Hogwarts. I guess I'd best be going, said Harry to Dylan. Dylan lowered his eyes uncomfortably. Then Harry turned to the rest of the family. It's been a pleasure knowing you, Mrs. Wycliffe, Vernon, he said politely. Goodbye, Holly, he added, and turned to leave. Thanks for everything, Dylan mumbled suddenly, his words stopping Harry in his tracks. Harry nodded silently, without looking back, and then continued on his way, vanishing within the crowd. That wasn't so bad, announced Dylan with relief as they returned to the car. He acted as if the civility of the whole encounter had been his idea, and was again his former confident self. Yes, dear, murmured Laurel softly. She suspected facing Cousin Harry had been the easy part. There was still Holly to deal with. As much as Dylan hated Hogwarts, he loved his daughter Holly. Holly hadn't said a word, but she was clearly unhappy about the situation, and there was still a new school to select. The family dinner that night was a disaster. Holly was now a vegetarian. Laurel knew nothing about vegetarian cooking, but had done some research in anticipation of Holly's return. Harry had mentioned Holly was partial to Indian curry, so Laurel had prepared and served what was supposed to be a traditional Indian meal of vegetable curry with rice. Holly dug in immediately, eating without hesitation. The rest of the family, Laurel included, merely picked at the food, unused to the strange spices and flavors. Suddenly Holly stopped, mid-bite, and looked at everyone else intently, noting their expressions and uneaten food. I'm sorry, she blurted abruptly, and fled the table, leaving her own food unfinished. No one ate much after that. Laurel gave up on serving the same foods to everyone. The next night she handed Holly the curry leftovers, while everyone else enjoyed meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and gravy. Holly blanched when she saw the meatloaf. She said nothing, but she held her head close to the curry, with her long blonde hair spread out on either side of her face, acting as blinders. She ate so quickly, Laurel was afraid Holly would get indigestion. Holly finished and left the table before anyone else had scarcely begun. Laurel then remembered Harry had mentioned it was the smells that affected Holly the most. The next night, Laurel gave Holly more leftovers and served the rest of the family cold ham instead. Holly didn't eat quite as quickly, but she kept her face averted from the rest of the table as she ate. The pungent odor of curry soon filled the dining room, overpowering the more delicate scent of the cold ham, making it a strange meal indeed. Planning meals became a major challenge for Laurel. Once she found the recipes, Holly pitched in to make her favorite curries. She was willing to eat almost everything else served, as long as the meat wasn't mixed in. Holly liked it best when the meat was served cold, less scent. But when the meat was prepared hot, she refused to even sit at the dinner table unless she had a curry in front of her. Unfortunately, Dylan preferred his food hot. He never said a word to Holly about her strange eating habits, but his looks and expressions as he watched her eat spoke volumes. There was none of the tension and the arguing of the previous year when Holly so desperately wanted to return to Hogwarts, but family meals remained an uncomfortable activity. A week after Holly's arrival, a thick package arrived at the house. The return address said Harry Potter, London. Laurel opened it up carefully. Within, she found 4 sealed envelopes, each bearing the official seal of Puddinghampton School. A 5th official-looking envelope was unsealed. A note was pinned across the front that read, "Extra transcripts, just in case. Let me know if you need more. Harry." Laurel pulled the paper out from the opened envelope and found a complete transcript bearing Holly's name, listing ordinary classes and giving her scores that would easily gain Holly admissions to any other school. Holly wandered into the kitchen and looked curiously over Laurel's shoulder at the papers. When Holly realized they were her transcripts, she dashed out of the room and slammed the door shut behind her. Laurel hastily put down the papers and followed her daughter. She found Holly in her room on the bed, sobbing. No explanation needed to be given. Holly was clutching the Hogwarts snow globe Harry had given her. She was staring at it intently through her tears. Laurel could do nothing but hold Holly tight and rock her gently until the tears dried out. There remained to find a new school for Holly. Neither Dylan nor Laurel knew how to select a school. As an unschooled empath, Holly had been so overwhelmed by outside emotions that she couldn't function on her own. Hogwarts had been thrust upon Holly and the family as a necessity. While at school, Holly had successfully learned how to block outside emotions and their influences, making Hogwarts a necessity no more. Smeltings had been a given for Vernon, as it was Dylan's alma mater. Dylan was proud of his years there and that his dad had attended there before him. There had been difficulties getting Vernon enrolled, though. The school had no record of a Wycliffe ever attending. Instead of the guaranteed enrollment due a child of an alumnus, Vernon had to go on the waiting list and was able to attend only because the school had available space. Laurel suspected Dylan had paid extra to ensure that Vernon got into the school. Though nothing was explained at the time, Laurel now realized that the problems were no doubt due to Dylan's name change some 20 years earlier, when Dylan and his family had moved from their original home, fleeing the possible wrath of some mad but powerful wizard called Lord Voldemort. Lord Voldemort was hunting Dylan's cousin Harry. Harry's friends and relatives were in danger because of this. The original danger was long over now, but Dylan and his parents had never bothered to change their names back. Partly because of the guilt he must have felt at making Holly so sad and her lack of opposition to his decision, Dylan was determined to find a school that would make Holly happy, as long as it wasn't Hogwarts. The new school had to accommodate vegetarians. It was clear Holly couldn't or wouldn't be changing her eating habits any time soon. And it had to accept pets. Laurel was adamant on that point. The move was not intended as a punishment, and Sasha should be able to accompany Holly. The alternative, of course, was keeping Sasha at the house, and Dylan agreed that neither of them wanted to do that. They knew very little about pet care. Every night after dinner, Dylan perused the internet, examining various schools. There were so many of them. He sent out numerous email inquiries confirming accommodations and entry requirements. Holly had neither hindered nor helped in his search. She barely spoke at all. When asked a school-related question, she merely replied softly, "Whatever you think is best," and would return to her book or cat or whatever she was doing. In frustration, Laurel finally grabbed a stack of the most promising brochures and dumped them in front of Holly one evening. Holly had been lying on her bed, reading a book on Shakespearean plays. "He loves you, you know," Laurel told Holly. Holly nodded silently while turning a page. She continued to read her book, ignoring the brochures. "He wants you to be happy," continued Laurel, "but he needs your help. It may seem right to play the martyr now, but whatever he selects, that's where you'll be living the next year, maybe longer. You, not him, Holly. Don't torture yourself more than necessary. Help us find a good place." Laurel left the room, closing the door behind her. Holly sighed and put down her book after first marking its place. She stared glumly at the stack of papers. Finally, Holly sat up, picked the first brochure on the top, and started reading it. The next morning, Holly quietly reappeared in the kitchen after breakfast, holding some of the brochures. Laurel stopped washing dishes to give Holly her full attention. "These places," Holly began hesitantly, "they say vegetarian food upon request. That makes me think no one who currently attends the school is actually a vegetarian. And these places," she added, holding up a different group of brochures, "they say they serve vegetarian food, but there's no vegetarian entrees listed in their menus." Holly paused. She looked down and bit her lip nervously. The Slytherins, she began cautiously. That caught Laurel's attention. Despite the numerous opportunities alone together and questions put to her, Holly had refused to talk about her last few months at Hogwarts, claiming that just thinking about it made her too sad. What would she say about the Slytherins, a group Laurel knew Holly didn't particularly like? When they realized I wasn't eating meat, Holly continued, speaking softly, they teased me something terrible. Oh, they figured out why I wasn't eating meat, and they teased me anyway. Next year, Holly added sorrowfully, I won't be able to tell anyone what happened or why I'm not eating meat. The other students won't understand. If there were more vegetarians attending classes, then maybe I won't stick out so much as odd. Maybe the other students won't expect me to try to explain. Her voice trailed off uncertainly. Laurel wiped her hands dry and solemnly took the brochures from Holly. That's good, dear, she said encouragingly. We'd have never thought of that. Thank you. We'll be sure to check all the menus and inquire about the other students. From then on, though Holly never actually approved of a school, she at least gave comments and suggestions and/or reasons to eliminate schools from the list. Holly spent much of her free time next door at the Rogers house. Mrs. Rogers didn't seem to mind Holly's melancholy mood. In fact, as Mrs. Rogers was still mourning the loss of her mother, she welcomed the distraction of Holly's presence. Holly discovered that Mrs. Rogers had a piano in the house and used to be a piano teacher. Holly had begun organ lessons while at Hogwarts. While not quite the same, both instruments had keyboards. Mrs. Rogers happily agreed to trade lessons for yard work, and Holly welcomed the chance to continue playing. Holly mentioned to Laurel, once in passing, it was nice to have a live instructor, making Laurel wonder how Holly had learned to play an organ without one. But she didn't ask, knowing Holly would only sigh mournfully and walk away without answering. Mrs. Rogers told Laurel she was impressed with Holly's musical abilities, especially considering the short time Holly had been playing. Laurel smiled proudly and privately wondered when Holly had found the time to practice with all the other classes she had taken. Laurel often heard the pleasant musical sounds of Holly practicing her lessons next door through an open window. Other times, the sounds of weirdly strange melodies that seemed both sad and lonely drifted out the window. Laurel knew they must be tunes Holly had learned while at Hogwarts. After much deliberation, the number of possible schools had been whittled down to 5. Dylan decided it was time to visit the schools personally before making a final decision. You can learn only so much through the photos and emails, he told Laurel. So Dylan took some time off work and they planned their trip. Of course, none of the 5 schools were near each other, and it would take several hours and sometimes a day or two between schools to reach them all. Laurel helped plan the route. Planning also included finding pet-friendly overnight accommodations and identifying restaurants along the way that carried food Holly would eat. Unfortunately, those plans hadn't taken into consideration how Holly would react to the scents commonly found in a restaurant. The first time they tried to eat in a regular place, the nausea had hit Holly so unexpectedly that she hadn't managed to make it to the bathroom before vomiting up her recently eaten meal. Dylan had left a rather large tip at that establishment as an apology. The next few meals weren't so bad. Laurel gave Holly a handkerchief heavily scented with perfume to help block out the other odors, and they chose their seating location with more care, someplace well ventilated, preferably near the toilets. Holly managed to stay seated to the very end, but she placed herself on the edge nearest the restrooms, just in case. The heavy perfume made all the nearby food smell weird, and the other customers looked at them strangely, but it seemed to help Holly. Unfortunately, all the precautions couldn't be counted on to help Holly all the time. Laurel again wished that there was some sort of book she could read to help deal with all this. Holly Wycliffe sat in the car and stared glumly out the window, watching the scenery pass. This trip had been a total disaster from day one. The cause for the trip alone was reason enough for it to be a disaster. She dreaded the next school visit. Holly knew the first school they visited was very wrong from the moment she met the headmaster. His emotions felt slimy, like a Slytherin. Nothing good could come of that. His manner was smooth and showy as they toured the campus, but the appearance of warmth and sincerity was never genuine. Dad didn't know that. He was impressed with the headmaster's flattery and flowery words. Holly would go wherever Dad put her, but surely there was someplace less disagreeable. How to put it into words when her dad asked Holly what she thought of the place? Holly kept silent in the presence of the headmaster. He took that to be shyness and thought it was cute, something they could easily overcome at his school, as if she wanted anything to do with the guy. Holly worked hard to not flinch when he patted her on the back. When the family entered the car, Dad asked Holly again what she thought of the school. "He lies a lot," said Holly finally. "What?" exclaimed Dad in surprise, twisting to look at her. "How can you say that? You saw for yourself it was a lovely school. Mr. Smythe has numerous degrees, and it is obviously a fine man. What would ever possess you to say such a thing?" Mr. Smythe was the headmaster. Holly pursed her lips closed, refusing to say more. Dad stared at her angrily, waiting for an explanation. Then he suddenly flushed, as if remembering what Holly was, and the skills she was supposed to have, the one that got her into Hogwarts in the first place. "All people lie sometimes, dear," interjected her mum gently. "What kind of lies?" Holly sighed and tried to organize her thoughts. "He didn't earn some of those degrees posted on the wall," she began. "There aren't any other vegetarians currently enrolled in the school. I think there were, but not now. He doesn't like cats, and when he said he had loads of work to do, he didn't. Not really." Dad sighed and leaned back in his seat, clearly disappointed. "Not this place," he said with finality, accepting Holly's word on the matter. "That's why I insisted we visit the schools personally." The next school was a bit better. It was an international riding academy. Holly had absolutely no interest in learning how to ride a horse. Brooms were bad enough. But pets were definitely welcome at this school, and the menus featured several Indian-type vegetarian-looking foods. Students could also take their meals in their rooms if they wished. The headmistress wasn't sure all the professors were competent, nor did she personally like the vegetarian food selection, but she was truly proud of her school. The family visited the stables as part of their tour. The horses reminded Holly of Professor Ferenz and Celeste, centaurs she had met while at Hogwarts. That brought back all sorts of memories Holly hadn't wanted to dwell upon. "Well," demanded Dad when they got back into the car, "what about this place?" Holly squeezed her eyes shut, lost in unwanted memories and too miserable to respond. This place made her homesick for Hogwarts. "I don't really like horses," she said finally in a soft voice. "Centaurs, yes. They were smart and could talk, but horses? They paled in comparison. It seemed almost criminal to ride them, though. Professor Ferenz and Celeste were not the sort to be ridden. How could she ride these horses while thinking of them?" "Besides the horses," said her mom gently, "was anything else here a serious problem?" Holly sighed. "No," she whispered reluctantly while shaking her head. "Right," said Dad happily. "This school's a possibility. Let's check out the next one," he added cheerfully. Even worse than visiting the schools was Holly's inability to control her stomach while in the restaurants. Holly was mortified that first time when she threw up all over everything. That had never happened at Hogwarts, and had been so long since she had felt that nauseated that she never expected it. Holly would have happily eaten every meal alone in the car, but Dad insisted they eat together. Mum's perfumed handkerchief had been a good idea for a while, but it couldn't be used again. Holly didn't tell Mum, but the combination of perfume and steak orders had dredged up previously forgotten memories of an opened, smoldering, scented overnight bag filled with melted lotion bottles and a charred, burned body nearby. Holly didn't mention it to anyone, but she'd been having a difficult time sleeping at night. Her nightmares had returned with a vengeance. Holly no longer had an organ to play before bed as she had done at Hogwarts. An alchemy didn't seem to be working as well as it had. Holly could empty her mind for a while, but she had nothing to fill it with afterwards. She couldn't fill her mind with happy thoughts, because she had none. Thinking of those she loved, like her family, didn't work because they were sending her off to some unknown school. Thinking of her friends only made her more miserable. Holly longed to talk to Cousin Harry, but didn't dare. Despite the almost friendly words between them at the station, Dad still didn't like him. Dad would see Holly's desire to consult with Cousin Harry as further proof that his decision to remove Holly from Hogwarts was justified. Besides, Holly had no idea how to even contact him. Mum must know somehow, but asking her meant explaining why, and Holly wasn't quite up to that. Holly wished desperately she had taken the time to develop some means to privately keep in touch with her cousins and Hufflepuff friends before she had left Hogwarts. She had been in denial then, hoping against hope that Cousin Harry was wrong, and that Dad would see how sad Holly was at the prospect of leaving Hogwarts and change his mind. It wasn't until the transcripts arrived that the finality of the situation sank in. By then, it was too late to figure out ways to contact Wizard family and friends. Holly did have her best friend Becky's address, as her parents were Muggles, like Holly's. All of Holly's mail to and from Hogwarts had gone through Becky's parents before being forwarded on, to ensure that nothing bearing the Hogwarts name would ever be found in the house and accidentally seen by the wrong persons. In particular, Holly's grandparents. They thought Holly attended some place called Aunt Hillary's Private Finishing School for Young Ladies for the last 2 years. Even now, they blamed Aunt Hillary for their granddaughter's recent shameful conversion to vegetarianism. The thought of Becky and writing her brought about new waves of sorrow. Holly closed her eyes, willing herself to not cry, trying to fight off the depression. The car lurched into a turn and then slowed to a stop. "Is this it?" Dad asked, meaning the place where they would spend the night. "I think so," agreed Mum. She twisted around in her seat. "Why don't you two stay here while we check it out and sign in?" she suggested to Holly and Vernon. "Okay," replied Vernon affably. He had an electronic game running. It didn't matter to him how long he sat in the car. Holly nodded her assent too. Getting out only meant one step closer to another sleepless night filled with scary bodies. Seeking a change of topic, Holly turned and studied her brother Vernon thoughtfully. Vernon had blonde hair and green eyes just like Holly. He was a year older and taller, but whereas Holly was slender, Vernon was stocky. He had thicker bones than Holly and a body to match. Recently, Vernon had taken up weightlifting, and muscle was replacing childhood fat. It looked good on him. Vernon used to be a bit of a bully. Holly could remember seeing him push other kids around at Puddinghampton School when she was younger. But in the last 2 years, Vernon had apparently turned a new leaf with a new friend and different behavior. Vernon hadn't complained once about the countryside drive to look at schools for Holly. In fact, he had accepted the news calmly, almost cheerfully. "How come you're not angry at me?" Holly asked abruptly. "What?" asked Vernon, looking up from his game. "You're stuck in a car driving around looking at junk for me, and you're not even upset," Holly explained. "I mean, you can't have wanted to go driving around like this. I'd be mad at me if I were you." "You're my sister," said Vernon, as if that explained everything. "That needn't stop you from feeling angry," persisted Holly. "People get frustrated and angry within families all the time, and for smaller reasons than this, but not you. I don't get it." "If it's got to be done, it's got to be done," Vernon said philosophically. "Why should I be upset?" "Because all I've been doing is messing up your life." "What do you mean?" "You got stuck caring for Sasha all last summer because I was grounded," began Holly. "And then I got you in trouble over Christmas holidays, and in trouble at your school with that letter I wrote, and now this. You didn't ask for this trip. It's got to be seriously boring for you at the least, and you're not even a bit upset." "So," replied Vernon calmly, "it's not like I had any other plans, so why not?" "But I threw up all over you," wailed Holly, still mortified thinking of the first time she had gotten sick at that restaurant. "Yeah," agreed Vernon ruefully, "that wasn't so good. But I've never seen anyone turn green so fast and really mean it. That part was pretty cool." "You're not even angry about it?" asked Holly in disbelief. "I was for a while," admitted Vernon, "but it cleaned up pretty easy. And remember, I got a new game chip out of it from Dad. I'm playing it now," he added, holding up his electronic game for Holly to see. "It's pretty good." "But how can you be so—" Vernon shut down his game and closed the case. "You want the truth?" he asked, looking at Holly directly. Holly nodded. "You were always kind of a sickly blob when you were little," he began. "I kept people from picking on you, partly because Mum said I had to look out for you, and because it gave me an excuse to push people around," he said, looking away. "Then you got better, and you got well, and you got, well, interesting." Vernon looked earnestly at Holly. "I never know what you're going to do next. I don't do that pushing stuff anymore," he confessed. "I don't really have any friends around our home because the people my age, they still will kind of push," he admitted. So without you, things at home would be pretty boring indeed. I'm sorry, said Holly sincerely. She'd never before inquired about Vernon's outside life during the summer and holidays, never much considered it. That's okay, replied Vernon. It's not your fault. Some of it is, insisted Holly. I wish I could help. Make up for all the trouble I've caused. You mean it? Asked Vernon hesitantly. Of course, she replied. Then tell me about the crash. What? Asked Holly, surprised at the request. Holly had been relieved that no one in the family had hassled her about being a vegetarian, correctly assuming that Cousin Harry had explained the situation to them earlier. It suddenly occurred to her that no one had once mentioned the crash either. The crash, repeated Vernon. Whatever it was that made you turn vegetarian, he explained with an eager light in his eye. Mom said I wasn't to talk to you about it because it was too upsetting, but, well, you got to see an airplane crash up close. How cool is that? You want to hear about the crash? Repeated Holly blankly. Who would ever want to hear about that? Yep, confirmed Vernon. Did you really see dead bodies and everything? He asked eagerly. Yes, confirmed Holly reluctantly. She hadn't really described any of that day since her conversation with Cousin Harry, and felt odd talking about it now. How many? Continued Vernon, oblivious of Holly's discomfort. Lots, replied Holly vaguely. There were 52 to be exact. Holly would never forget that number. Wow, said Vernon admiringly. I've only seen one myself, he stated proudly, reminding Holly of how Vernon had happily described the removal of Mrs. Rogers' mother's body 2 years earlier. Were they all still strapped down in their seats or what? He asked with interest. How did they die? He continued, not waiting for an answer. I want to know everything. Everything? Everything, replied Vernon, with an almost morbid glint in his eyes. He looked so hopeful. A gentle tap on the window interrupted their conversation. Vernon and Holly looked up at the sound to see their mother standing outside Holly's car door. Time for you to help bring the bags. Vernon and Holly obligingly got out of the car. They collected their things and brought them into the designated room. Mom? Asked Holly when their things had been unpacked and everything was ready for the night. Dad had already settled down to watch the tube. Can I take a walk and look around outside? I feel as if I've been cramped indoors way too long. Me too, said Vernon, noting the significant look in Holly's eye and hastily shutting down his game. Okay, said their mum. Here's the key, she said, handing the room key to Vernon. But stay together and don't stray too far. We will and we won't, assured Vernon, pocketing the key and grabbing a jacket. Holly got her own jacket and the two left the room. Sasha trailed along behind. The Wycliffes had stopped at a bed and breakfast for the night. It was located in a quiet neighborhood. The two stepped outside. Sasha ran ahead, her silky gray body brushing Holly's legs as she ran past them, eager to be out and explore. Vernon closed the door behind them while Holly looked around for other people. It was fairly late in the evening. The sky had begun to darken due to the setting sun. At the moment, there were only a few joggers out using the sidewalks. You really want to know about the crash? She asked as they started down the sidewalk. Yep, breathed Vernon happily as he walked alongside Holly. Everything? Everything, came the eager reply. What did you see first, the plane or the bodies? Holly took a deep breath. The plane, she finally answered. I didn't see the bodies until later. It didn't even occur to me there might be bodies. Holly would have never considered relating a description of the crash to anyone, let alone her brother. But Vernon genuinely wanted to hear the details. And he didn't want to know in a mean or malicious way. He just wanted to know. It seemed a small enough price to pay for all the trouble she had caused him. She let Vernon set the pace, answering his every question, and in doing so gradually recounted her experience at the crash site that day. Vernon happily absorbed every morbid detail. His responses and comments were often punctuated with ew and gross, but he wasn't disgusted, not at all, and kept asking for more. Vernon had absolutely no interest in the 11 survivors. They lived. Tell me about the others. And truly regretted that Holly hadn't thought to bring a camera and take photos. Doesn't all this bother you? Asked Holly when Vernon had finally run out of questions. It was fairly dark by then, but the street lights that had flickered on made it easy to see. No, not really, replied Vernon. I mean, yeah, I'm sorry it happened, and sorry for all those people, but it's not like I knew any of them. Mostly it's all just really, really interesting. Kenny's dad is a mortician, he added. Kenny was Vernon's new friend at Smeltings. Kenny talks about dead bodies all the time. It's no big deal, really, he concluded. Somebody has to take care of them. The two continued walking down the sidewalk, glancing occasionally at the neatly manicured yards on either side, easily visible from the illumination of streetlights. But not body parts, Vernon added as an afterthought. Kenny doesn't talk about body parts. Oh, said Holly, not knowing what else to say. We got to dissect frogs and cow eyes in biology this year, added Vernon brightly. That was really cool. But there wasn't a lot of blood or anything. Vernon fell silent as they neared their house, the two of them having already walked around the block more than once. I'm glad you got to help some of them, he told Holly solemnly, while stopping at the front door, even if they didn't know you were there. Me too, agreed Holly softly, still wishing she could have done more. Vernon used his key to get back inside, and the two of them rejoined their parents for bedtime. Holly felt wrung out and exhausted by the time she had fully satisfied Vernon's curiosity. Strangely enough, though, Holly no longer felt as distressed by the sights she had seen. It was hard to be horrified and appalled when the person next to her did not share the same sentiment. Vernon's enthusiasm had somehow worn off on her. That night, as she practiced alchemy, Holly emptied her mind as usual, but refilled it with thoughts of Vernon, his cheerfulness and enthusiasm. She added her memories of Vernon's emotions that she had felt during their conversation. Holly woke the next morning fully rested after having experienced the best night of sleep in ages.